Take a look at what's going on in this excerpt from John Stuart Mill's book Utilitarianism. This is a very brief excerpt from a long, not a long book, but a longer exposition of a certain moral theory, and that moral theory is utilitarianism. It is a moral theory in a different way than, let's say, moral objectivism or moral relativism is. It is a certain theory about right and wrong and how to tell the difference, and gives you a criterion or a principle for doing so. That is, when a utilitarian is somebody who believes that the moral worth of an action depends upon its usefulness, or what is the same, to what degree it increases or decreases human happiness. So if we ask whether an action is right or wrong, we have to know its effects, its consequences, and the effects or consequences that matter are the impacts on human welfare. So his principle of utility, or greatest happiness principle, is what starts this reading off. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And that's what's essential about the principle, right? When we say that an action is right, well, we say it's right insofar as it promotes happiness. If we say that it's wrong, we say that it's wrong insofar as it produces the reverse of happiness or unhappiness. And that's about it, right? But then he goes on to define what he means by happiness, which is actually quite honest of him, I think, you know, philosophically. But it's something that he immediately, as we'll see, feels that he has to defend. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So, what is happiness? Happiness is pleasure. What is unhappiness? Unhappiness is pain and the privation, the taking away of pleasure. So he's given you a rule for how to determine whether an action is right or whether it's wrong. And he's given you a definition of happiness as pleasure. And it's that in the rest of the reading he is defending. Because, as he says, a lot of people think that this definition of happiness is degrading to human nature. It actually is a form of hedonism. Hedonism is just comes from the Greek word for pleasure, hedone. It's just the theory that the point of life is pleasure and maximizing the amount of pleasure that you experience in life and minimizing pain and suffering. Some people would say it's the common sense way of living. Some people would say, as the critics that he anticipates here, that it is degrading to human beings, that, for instance, it reduces to the level of pigs. That is, if the whole point of our lives is just to get as much pleasure as we can before we die, then that's the way a pig lives. And we're not pigs. So it's degrading to human nature, supposedly. And Mill says something very interesting. He says, well, here, right here, he says, if this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then be no longer an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life, which is good enough for the one, would be good enough for the other. The comparison of the Epicurean life. And the Epicurean life is just referencing the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who said that pleasure and enjoyment were the point of life. And so Mill is a kind of an Epicurean. The comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. I do not indeed consider the Epicureans, etc., etc. What he's basically saying is that, you know, yes, human beings want pleasure, but human pleasures, which include all sorts of pleasures that the pig and other animals um, are not capable of. So he ends his paragraph here saying it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. So that's the point. And over here is the famous line that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And what is he saying? Well, I mean, yeah, the, to say that the point of life is pleasure, the understanding is human pleasures, and also that there are some pleasures which are simply more pleasurable and better than other pleasures. And by them, he means the pleasures essentially of the mind and of imagination and social intercourse. So, how do you prove something like that? How do you prove that some pleasures, let's say the pleasures of listening to music or reading, are intrinsically more pleasurable than, say, the pleasures of the body, eating and drinking? He says the only way you prove it is by asking somebody who's experienced both which one they value more. So he says here, from this verdict, the only competent judges I apprehend there can be no appeal. On a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, or which of two modes of existence is the most grateful to the feelings, apart from its moral attributes and from its consequences, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. That is, people who have experienced both, which one do they prefer? And there needs to be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasures, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what is the um, what is the judgment? He says that people who've experienced both prefer the so-called higher pleasures. You know, that is, it's just pure preference. So that may or may not be true. I guess what Mill thinks it's true that people who've experienced drinking beer and reading Shakespeare, they may enjoy both of them. They would say that they would rather have the pleasures of reading. Let's just say the reading literature in general, and the pleasures of drinking alcohol, or they'd rather have the pleasures of listening to music rather than the pleasures of eating hamburgers. I don't know. The question then at the end of chapter 4, or the end of this section, chapter 4, is whether the principle of utility is provable. That is, can we prove that happiness is the basis of life? Can we prove, therefore, that pleasure and happiness are what life is about, and that everything that we want because of those things? Really, he says the only proof, this is a first principle, so it can't be proved. The only way to demonstrate is to ask yourself, is there anything in life that you don't value for the sake of either your own happiness or the happiness of someone else? And that's where the question we're left with.